Sign it, Alton. Just one signature and everything ends. My hands were trembling when Uncle pushed those papers in front of me. I couldn't understand how this was happening just 4 days ago. I was a normal college student, working part-time at a cafe, living alone in my tiny apartment, and now I was being told that my mother had accumulated such a massive debt at an underground casino that she'd fled, and that debt would be cleared with my life. Uncle had first offered me the option to pay, laughing as he did. $10 million in 4 months? Do you even know your place? Then he'd presented the second option, sell me, to some authority who could pay the price. My heart had sunk. I'd become property, an object that could be auctioned off. Now I stood inside this enormous cold mansion where everything was so pristine and expensive that I was afraid to touch anything. Uncle had led me to a bedroom door and said, "This is your room. Living here, sleeping here, staying alive here, everything will run according to the will of the man who's taken you. Understood?" I'd said nothing, just watched his retreating back as the door closed. I was left alone, completely empty. The bedroom was large but felt suffocating, like I couldn't breathe. I thought maybe I was dreaming, but then the door opened, and the man Uncle had told me about walked in. Addison Kane. At first glance I knew this wasn't someone you could have a conversation with. His eyes were steel gray, completely emotionless. No softness anywhere on his face. His suit was black, perfectly tailored, and he walked as if every step was calculated. He approached me, looked me up and down, then spoke. "What's your name?" My voice caught in my throat. "A. Alton," I somehow managed to say. He didn't smile, just gave me a glance. "All right, Alton. There are some rules here. First rule, you don't talk to anyone about me. Second rule, when I call, you come. Third rule, don't try to run. Understood?" I just nodded. He leaned toward me, so close I could smell his cologne, dark, intense. "Good," he whispered, then straightened and walked away. I stood there alone, drenched in fear, wondering how my life was about to be destroyed. I couldn't sleep that night, just those gray eyes spinning in my mind. Addison Kane, the city's most dangerous mafia boss. And now I was his property. The bedroom felt like a cage even though it was spacious. Cream-colored walls, a king-sized bed with silk sheets, floor-to-ceiling windows that showed nothing but darkness outside. There was a bathroom, attached marble floors, a bathtub that looked like it belonged in a luxury hotel. Everything screamed wealth, but none of it felt welcoming. It felt cold, clinical, like a beautiful prison cell. I sat on the edge of the bed, my fingers gripping the sheets, trying to process what had just happened. My mother had gambled away money she didn't have, and when the debt collectors came calling, she'd disappeared, left me to deal with the consequences. Uncle, my father's brother, had shown up at my apartment 3 days ago with 2 large men. He'd explained the situation with a cruel efficiency that made it clear he'd done this before. Maybe not with family, but with someone. "Your mother owes some very dangerous people a lot of money," he'd said, sitting on my threadbare couch like he owned the place. "They want their payment. Since she's gone, that debt falls to you." I'd argued, of course, told him I had nothing to do with her choices, that I hadn't spoken to her in over a year, that this wasn't legal. He'd laughed at that word, legal. "Kid, these people don't care about legal. They care about getting what they're owed. Now you've got 2 choices. Come up with the money, or we find another way for you to pay." The other way had been this: being sold to someone who could clear the debt. Uncle had made some calls, arranged some meetings I wasn't part of, and within 48 hours I was standing in front of Addison Kane, being told I now belonged to him. I'd researched Addison during those 2 days, using my phone frantically before Uncle confiscated it. The articles were vague but terrifying. Suspected connections to organized crime. Multiple businesses that seemed legitimate but were rumored to be fronts. People who crossed him disappeared. There were no photos. He kept himself out of the public eye, but the reputation was enough. And now I'd seen him in person, and somehow that was worse than anything I'd imagined. He wasn't some caricature of a villain. He was real, he was calm, he was controlled, and that made him more frightening than if he'd been openly threatening. I walked to the window and looked out. The mansion grounds stretched far into the darkness. I could see the shadows of trees, the outline of a high wall in the distance. There were lights moving, guards patrolling. Of course there were guards. Uncle's words echoed in my head. Don't try to run, as if I'd get far. I didn't even know where I was. The drive here had taken over an hour, but I'd been too shocked to pay attention to directions. I was trapped, completely and utterly trapped. My phone was gone. My apartment, if it was even still mine, was unreachable. My friends from college would probably think I'd dropped out, disappeared. Maybe they'd worry for a week or two, then move on with their lives. I had no family who cared. My father had died when I was 12. My mother had spiraled after that, becoming someone I didn't recognize. An uncle had always been distant until he'd seen an opportunity to use me. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window, feeling tears threaten but refusing to let them fall. Crying wouldn't change anything. It wouldn't make this nightmare end. I needed to think, to figure out how to survive this. Addison had said I belonged to him now. But what did that mean? What did he want from me? The uncertainty was almost worse than knowing. My imagination filled in terrible possibilities, each one more horrifying than the last. I turned away from the window and explored the room more thoroughly. The closet was empty except for a few hangers. The drawers were vacant. There was nothing personal here, nothing that suggested anyone had ever lived in this space. It was a guest room, I realized. Or maybe a room kept specifically for situations like this. How many others had been here before me? How many people had Addison Kane bought and brought to this mansion? The thought made me sick. I sat back down on the bed, then lay back, staring at the ceiling. An ornate chandelier hung there, crystal and gold, probably worth more than everything I'd ever owned combined. The absurdity of it struck me. I was lying in luxury while my freedom had just been sold. The contrast felt like a cruel joke. Sleep seemed impossible, but eventually exhaustion won. My last conscious thought was of those gray eyes, emotionless and cold, looking at me like I was something he'd purchased at a store. And I supposed, in a way, I was. I'd been given a price tag and Addison Kane had paid it. Now I had to figure out what that meant for whatever was left of my life. The next morning, I woke up convinced I'd find a way to survive somehow. When I made my way downstairs to the dining hall, he was already there, drinking black coffee and looking at his phone. I hesitantly pulled out a chair and sat down. But my breathing was so rapid I thought he might hear it. For several minutes there was complete silence, just the sound of a spoon. Then suddenly he spoke. "You used to work?" I looked at him shocked. "Yes. At a cafe." He nodded and went back to his phone. A little while later he set down his coffee cup and said, "Do you need anything? Books? Clothes? Laptop?" I was confused. I'm fine," I said awkwardly. He raised an eyebrow as if surprised by my answer. "All right," he said and stood up straight. "I'm going to work. Don't leave the house, there are guards." And he left. I spent the entire day exploring the mansion. This place was so huge it felt like a hotel. There was a library, a gym, an indoor pool, everything. But everything was so empty and lifeless, as if no one actually lived here. In the evening when Addison returned, I was in the library, trying to read a novel. He stood in the doorway watching me, like he couldn't understand what I was doing. "You're reading?" he asked. I held up the book to show him. "Yes. There are a lot of books here." For the first time, I saw a strange expression on his face. Maybe interest, maybe surprise. "You like books?" he asked. "Yes. Very much," I answered. He didn't say anything, just nodded and left. But that night when I was in my room, there was a knock. I opened the door and a staff member stood there, holding a package. "Mr. Kane sent this for you," she said. I opened the package and inside were 3 new books. The genres I liked. There was also a note. "The library has old books. These are new." My heart felt strange. What was this? Kindness? Or another form of control? But when I lay in bed for the first time I thought that maybe Addison wasn't as much of a monster as I'd imagined. Maybe he was lonely too. Like me. Maybe he had a story he'd never told anyone. And maybe, just maybe, this wasn't as bad as I'd thought. But still, I knew this was wrong. I wasn't here by choice. I was here because I had a price. And that truth was tearing me apart from the inside. The morning had started strangely. When I'd opened my eyes for a brief moment I'd forgotten where I was. Then reality crashed back and I remembered I was in Addison Kane's mansion, owned by a man I didn't know, trapped in a life I hadn't chosen. I'd forced myself out of bed, showered in that enormous marble bathroom, and dressed in the clothes that had mysteriously appeared in the closet overnight. They fit perfectly, which was somehow more unsettling than if they hadn't. It meant Addison or someone working for him had assessed me, measured me, determined my size without my knowledge. The dining hall was intimidating. A long mahogany table that could seat 20 people, but only 2 places were set, one at the head where Addison sat and one several seats down. I'd initially moved toward that distant seat, but he'd gestured to the chair immediately to his right. "Sit here," he'd said, not looking up from his phone. So I had. Breakfast was elaborate, fresh fruit, pastries, eggs prepared 3 different ways, coffee, juice. More food than I could possibly eat. A woman in a white uniform had served us silently, then disappeared. We'd eaten in that uncomfortable silence until he'd asked about my work. His question had caught me off guard because it was normal. Too normal. Like we were 2 people having breakfast together instead of captor and captive. After he'd left, I'd wandered. The mansion was labyrinthine. Grand hallways with paintings that looked centuries old. Rooms that served no clear purpose. Sitting rooms with furniture no one sat on. Parlors with pianos no one played. The library had drawn me in immediately. Floor-to-ceiling shelves packed with books. A rolling ladder to reach the higher shelves. Leather chairs positioned near windows. It was the first place that had felt alive. Even though it was empty, I'd run my fingers along the spines, reading titles, classic literature, modern fiction, philosophy, history, art books. The collection was extensive and eclectic. Someone had spent time building this library, curating it. Was it Addison? Did a man like him read? The thought seemed impossible, and yet the evidence was all around me. I'd pulled out a novel, something I'd been meaning to read for months, but hadn't had time for between work and school. School. The thought hit me suddenly. What about school? I was supposed to be at class right now. I was in the middle of the semester. Would they drop me for non-attendance? Would anyone even notice I was gone? The reality of my isolation became sharper. I settled into one of the leather chairs and tried to focus on the book, but the words swam. I kept reading the same page over and over, unable to concentrate. What was I supposed to do with myself here? Just exist, wait for Addison to tell me what he wanted from me. The uncertainty was suffocating. When evening came and I heard the front door open, my whole body tensed. I heard his footsteps. He walked with a distinctive rhythm, measured and purposeful. I stayed in the library, partially hidden by a bookshelf, watching as he passed by. He glanced in, saw me and paused. That's when he'd asked if I was reading. The conversation had been brief, but something about it felt different from the morning. He'd seemed curious, almost confused by my presence, like he wasn't sure what to make of someone who chose to spend their time with books. After he'd left, I'd tried to continue reading, but my mind was racing. Who was Addison Kane, really? What did he do all day when he left the mansion? The blood I'd noticed on his shirt cuff when he'd walked past. Whose blood was it? What kind of work left you coming home with blood on your clothes? The package that arrived later that night had shocked me more than anything else. The books were new releases, bestsellers I'd had on my mental wish list. The note was written in clean, precise handwriting. He'd taken the time to write to me, to get me something. Why? Was this some kind of psychological tactic? Make the prisoner comfortable so they're easier to control? Or was it something else? I'd sat on my bed holding those books, feeling confused. I wanted to be angry, to reject this gesture, but I couldn't, because the truth was, in this empty, cold mansion, those books felt like a lifeline. They felt like someone had seen me not as property but as a person who liked reading. That night, I'd lain awake thinking about the contradiction that was Addison Kane. The man who'd bought me. The man who'd given me books. The dangerous mafia boss. The person who seemed lonely in his enormous house. I couldn't reconcile these different images, and that confusion kept me awake long into the night, staring at the ceiling, wondering what tomorrow would bring. 3 weeks passed and I was settling into this life, whether I wanted to or not. Addison often came home late at nights, sometimes with blood on his suit. At first I'd been frightened, but then I got used to it. He'd go straight to his room and I wouldn't see him again that night. But one night everything changed. I'd gone to the kitchen for water when I saw him sitting on the living room couch, shirt removed, a large cut on his shoulder. He was trying to bandage it himself, his jaw tight with pain. At first I thought about ignoring it, but I couldn't. "Do you need help?" I said hesitantly. He looked at me, surprised. "What are you doing here?" "Getting water." "But you—" "The bandage isn't going on properly," I said. He watched me for a moment, then held out the bandage toward me. "Fine. Do it." I approached and looked at his cut. It was deep, probably from a knife. My hands were shaking as I started applying the bandage. He was completely silent, just watching me. "Why aren't you afraid anymore?" he suddenly asked. I stopped. "What?" "Before, you trembled when you saw me. Now you don't. Why?" I looked into his eyes. This time there was something different in them. Maybe curiosity, maybe loneliness, because now I'm more afraid of myself. I admitted truthfully that I've adjusted here so easily. He went quiet, then said softly, "This isn't adjusting, Alton. This is surviving. And you're doing well." Then he took my hand for just a second and released it. "Thank you," he said. My heart started racing. This was the first time he'd thanked me. After finishing the bandage, he stood up and picked up his shirt. "Do you see me as human?" he suddenly asked. I looked at him confused. "What do you mean people think I'm a monster?" "Maybe they're right. But you look at me like I'm just a man." I said nothing because the truth was, yes, I'd started seeing him that way. When I returned to my room, I couldn't sleep. Because now I'd begun to feel that Addison had a heart too. A broken heart. And maybe I was starting to understand him a little. But thinking all this was wrong, because he was still the man who'd bought me. He was still the man who held my freedom, and I was still his property. The 3 weeks had developed a strange routine. Addison left early each morning. Usually before I woke up, though sometimes I'd catch him at breakfast. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his questions were oddly personal. He'd asked about my major at college, English literature. He'd asked about my favorite authors, whether I preferred fiction or nonfiction, what I wanted to do after graduation. These conversations felt surreal, like we were two normal people getting to know each other, not a man and the person he owned. I'd learned to read his moods by small signs. When he loosened his tie immediately upon entering, the day had been stressful. When he poured whiskey before dinner, something had gone wrong. When he disappeared into his study without a word, I knew not to disturb him. The night I'd helped him with the bandage, I'd noticed more than just the cut. His torso was covered in scars, some old and faded, others more recent. Each one told a story of violence, of a life lived on the edge of danger. When my fingers had accidentally brushed against one while applying the bandage, he'd flinched slightly, not from pain but from the unexpected contact. It had occurred to me then that maybe no one touched Addison Kane gently. Maybe every touch he experienced was violent. Fighting, defending, attacking. The thought had made me sad in a way I didn't want to examine too closely. His question about fear had caught me off guard because I'd been wondering the same thing. When had I stopped being terrified? The first week, I'd barely slept, jumping at every sound, expecting something terrible to happen. But nothing had. Addison had largely left me alone. I had free reign of the mansion except for his study and bedroom. I ate well. I had books, access to the gym, the pool. In terms of comfort, I was better off than I'd been in my cramped apartment. But comfort wasn't freedom, and I never let myself forget that this gilded cage was still a cage. What he'd said about surviving versus adjusting had stayed with me. Was there a difference? Wasn't survival just long-term adjustment? I'd been mulling over these philosophical questions when I should have been thinking about escape. But where would I go? I had no money. Uncle had taken everything when he'd sold me. I had no phone. I didn't even know the address of this mansion. And even if I managed to get away, the debt would still exist. The people my mother owed would still come looking for payment. At least here I was safe. The irony wasn't lost on me. I felt safer in the house of a mafia boss than I did in the outside world. His admission about seeing me as human had created a shift between us. After that night, things changed subtly. He started eating dinner at home more often, and he'd gesture for me to join him. We'd eat in silence mostly, but sometimes he'd ask me about my day. What had I read? Had I used the gym? Was there anything I needed? These questions felt like he was checking on me, making sure I was okay. It was confusing because it contradicted everything I'd expected. I thought he'd be cruel, demanding, violent. But he was none of those things. He was distant, yes. Closed off, absolutely, but not cruel. One evening about a week after the bandage incident, I'd worked up the courage to ask him a question. We were in the dining room, finishing dinner, and I'd said, "Can I ask you something?" He'd looked up from his plate, expression neutral. "Go ahead." I'd hesitated, then pushed forward. Why did you agree to this? To having me here?" He'd set down his fork carefully, his gray eyes studying me. For a long moment he didn't answer, and I thought maybe I'd crossed a line. Then he'd said, "Your uncle approached me through intermediaries. He needed someone who could clear a significant debt quickly and quietly. He'd paused, seemed to reconsider his words. I needed something else. It was a transaction that benefited both parties. But I wasn't a party," I'd said quietly. "I didn't agree to anything." His jaw had tightened slightly. "No, you didn't. And I'm not going to pretend that's fair or right." The honesty had surprised me. I'd expected him to justify it, to make excuses. But he didn't. He'd simply acknowledged the truth that I'd been treated as an object, not a person, and that it wasn't fair. It wasn't an apology, but it was something. We'd finished dinner in silence after that. But it had felt different. Like we'd established some kind of understanding. I still didn't know what Addison wanted from me, why he'd really agreed to this arrangement, but I was beginning to think maybe he didn't fully know either. That night, lying in bed, I'd thought about broken hearts. Addison had one, I was sure of it now. Something had damaged him, made him into this closed-off, carefully controlled person. And maybe, in some twisted way, we weren't so different. We were both people shaped by circumstances we hadn't chosen, trying to survive in situations we hadn't wanted. The difference was that he had power and I didn't. He could leave any time. I couldn't, and that difference mattered more than anything else. 2 weeks later, Addison made me a strange offer. He wanted to take me outside. Just dinner. Somewhere normal, he said while we were having breakfast. I looked at him shocked. "Why?" "Because you've been locked in here for 5 weeks. And I don't want to watch you go insane," he said plainly. I couldn't refuse. Truthfully, I desperately wanted to go outside. So that evening, we went to an Italian restaurant, a place that felt normal, elegant. Addison wore casual clothes. It was the first time I'd seen him without a suit. In a black turtleneck and dark jeans, he looked different, human, approachable. During dinner we actually talked, had a real conversation. I told him about my college, about my dreams. He listened quietly, occasionally giving a small smile. "You wanted to be a writer?" he asked with curiosity. "Yes. But it's probably not possible anymore," I said sadly. "Why not?" he asked seriously. "Because I'm here. With you. This world isn't mine, Addison," I admitted truthfully. He set down his glass and leaned toward me. "Whatever this world is, Alton, your dreams haven't ended. Remember that." In that moment, for the first time I felt like maybe my feelings were changing toward him. Maybe I wasn't seeing him just as a jailer anymore. Maybe there was something else drawing me to him. But then everything shattered. As we tried to leave the restaurant, suddenly there were gunshots. Addison immediately pushed me down, covering me with his body. "Stay down," he ordered. My ears were ringing. My breath had stopped. A few seconds later it was over. His guards had handled the situation. But when I looked up, blood was flowing from Addison's arm. "Addison," I shouted. "I'm fine," he said through gritted teeth. But he wasn't fine. In the car I removed his jacket and looked at his wound. It was a bullet graze. "This wasn't because of you," he said as if reading my thoughts. "This is my world, Alton. And now you're in it too." "I'm sorry." His voice held regret for the first time. It was the first time he'd said sorry. That night I realized that I wasn't just property to Addison anymore. I'd become his weakness. And in this world, weakness meant death. And perhaps I was also feeling fear for myself. The restaurant had been beautiful. Soft lighting, the smell of fresh bread and garlic, classical music playing quietly in the background. We'd been seated in a corner booth, partially secluded from other diners. It had felt almost like a date, which was absurd given our circumstances. But sitting across from Addison, watching him study the menu with genuine concentration, asking my opinion on what to order, it had felt normal. More than normal. It had felt nice. We'd talked about books we'd both read, debated the merits of different authors. He'd been surprisingly well read and his opinions were thoughtful, nuanced. He wasn't just some brutal enforcer. He had depth, intelligence, culture. When he'd asked about my writing aspirations, something in his tone had been tender. Like he genuinely cared about my answer, about my lost dreams. His response telling me my dreams hadn't ended, had struck something deep in my chest. No one had ever encouraged me like that. My mother had always dismissed writing as impractical. My friends had been supportive in a vague way but never truly understood. But Addison, this man who'd bought me, who owned me, was telling me not to give up. The contradiction was dizzying. I'd been about to say something, to thank him maybe, when the first shot rang out. Everything happened so fast. Addison's reflexes were incredible. He'd moved before I'd even processed what was happening, throwing me to the ground and shielding me with his entire body. I'd felt the weight of him, solid and protective, heard his heart pounding against my back. More shots, screaming, glass shattering, then silence broken only by people crying. When Addison had pulled me up, his face had been completely transformed. Gone was the man who'd been smiling at me over pasta. This was the Mafia boss, cold and calculating, scanning for threats. His arm was bleeding but he didn't seem to notice or care. He dragged me toward the exit where a car was already waiting. His guards were efficient. Inside the vehicle as we sped away, I'd started shaking. Delayed shock, I suppose. My hands wouldn't stop trembling. Addison had noticed, had reached for my hand and held it firmly. Breathe, he'd commanded, and somehow I had matching my breaths to his. Only then had I seen the blood spreading across his sleeve. When I'd reached for it, he'd tried to pull away, but I'd insisted. The wound wasn't deep but it was long. A burning line across his bicep where the bullet had grazed him. Who were they? I'd asked while examining it. Does it matter? His voice had been flat. They wanted to hurt you to hurt me. That's all you need to know. The weight of that statement had settled over me like a blanket. People wanted to hurt me now. Not because of anything I'd done, but simply because I existed in Addison's orbit. I'd become a target, a vulnerability, a way to get to him. The realization was terrifying. Back at the mansion, Addison had disappeared into his study immediately, barking orders into his phone. I'd gone to my room, sat on my bed, and tried to process what had happened. Someone had tried to kill us, or kill him and take me, or just send a message. Whatever the motivation, the result was the same. My world had just gotten infinitely more dangerous. I'd thought I understood what being with Addison meant. I'd thought I grasped the reality of his world. But I'd been naive. This wasn't just about being owned or controlled. This was about being in constant danger, about looking over your shoulder, about never feeling truly safe. And yet when those shots had fired, Addison had protected me without hesitation. He'd put himself between me and the bullets. He could have used me as a shield, could have saved himself first. But he hadn't. He'd chosen to protect me, even at risk to himself. That action spoke louder than any words. Later that night, I'd heard him in the hallway outside my room. His footsteps had paused by my door, and I'd wondered if he'd knock. But after a moment, they'd continued on. I'd wanted to go to him, to check on his arm, to talk about what happened. But I'd stayed in bed, paralyzed by confusion about what I was feeling. Fear, yes. But also something else. Gratitude. Connection. Maybe even the beginning of something deep. The dreams that night had been violent. Gunshots echoing endlessly. Blood spreading across white tablecloths. Addison's gray eyes going dark and empty. I'd woken up gasping, covered in sweat, and realized something crucial. I didn't want Addison to die. Not just because of what would happen to me but because the thought of him being gone, of never seeing him again, of that sharp intelligence and hidden kindness being erased from the world. It hurt. It hurt in a way that told me I'd already crossed some invisible line. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was starting to care. And that was the most dangerous thing of all. The next morning when I woke up, there was a strange tension in the mansion. There were more guards, and Addison was locked in his study. I knocked but got no answer. The whole day passed and he didn't speak to me. That night, when I couldn't sleep, I decided I'd go see him, whether he wanted me to or not. The study door was slightly open and I could hear voices inside. Addison was talking to someone on the phone. Yes, Alton's debt has been officially cleared. His mother's name has been removed from the records too. But he doesn't know. My breath stopped. What? If he finds out, he'll leave and I can't let him go. He's become necessary to me. I've fallen in love with him. My heart shattered into pieces. The debt was clear, meaning I was free, and Addison hadn't told me why? Because he wanted to keep me? I pushed the door open hard and burst inside. Addison hung up the phone and looked at me. Guilt was clear in his eyes. Alton, how long have you known? I asked in a shaking voice. How long have you known I was free? He stood up, trying to stay calm. 3 weeks? 3 weeks? I shouted. You kept me here for 3 weeks when I could have left. You lied to me. You imprisoned me by your own choice. I was protecting you. He finally raised his voice. You had enemies out there. If you'd left, they would have killed you. I wanted to keep you safe. That wasn't your decision to make. I started crying. I'm not your property, Addison. I'm a human being. I have rights. I should have had a choice. He came toward me, trying to touch my arm, but I jerked away. Don't touch me. You're the same as everyone else. A control freak. You only see what benefits you. You don't care about my feelings. That's not true, Alton. I love, don't lie. I shouted. If you really loved me, why didn't you tell me the truth? Because you still see me as your property, that's all. I looked at his broken face and ran toward my room. Locking the door, I collapsed on the bed and truly cried for the first time. Because the man I'd started to trust, the man I'd maybe developed feelings for, he'd also betrayed me. He'd also failed to see me as human. All night Addison kept knocking on the door, calling my name, apologizing. But I didn't open the door. Because now I understood that all of this was wrong. Everything. The day had been torture. I'd spent hours in the library trying to distract myself with books. But the words had been meaningless. My mind kept circling back to the previous night. To the shooting. To Addison's body covering mine. To the fear I'd felt at seeing him hurt. I'd been confused about my feelings, unable to sort through the tangle of emotions. So I'd decided to talk to him, to maybe try to understand what was happening between us. That's why I'd gone to his study. That's why I'd been standing outside the door when I'd heard him on the phone. The conversation had been like a knife to the chest. 3 weeks. He'd known for 3 weeks that I was free to go, and he'd said nothing. Every morning when he'd asked how I was, every dinner we'd shared, every small kindness, all of it had been built on a lie. He'd been keeping me prisoner not because of the debt, not because of any obligation, but because he wanted to. Because he'd decided without consulting me that I should stay. The words "I've fallen in love with him" should have meant something, should have softened the betrayal, but they didn't, because love that came with chains wasn't love at all. It was possession. It was control. It was everything I'd feared when I'd first arrived at this mansion. When I'd confronted him, the look on his face had been genuinely distressed. Maybe he did love me, in his own twisted way, but that didn't excuse what he'd done. His justification about protection, about enemies, maybe it was even true. But the point was, he'd made that choice for me. He'd decided what I needed, what was best for me, without giving me any say. Just like my mother had decided to gamble away money that affected my life. Just like my uncle had decided to sell me. Just like everyone in my life had always decided things about me without my input. His attempt to touch me had felt violating after the revelation. I didn't want his comfort, his reassurance. I wanted my freedom. I wanted my choice. The way he'd said, "I was protecting you," had made it worse, not better, because it revealed how he saw things. He was the powerful one who made decisions, and I was the weak one who needed protection. Never mind what I wanted. Never mind my agency. His door knocking throughout the night had been relentless. I'd heard him saying my name over and over. Heard him say, "Please just let me explain." Heard him say, "I'm sorry, I made a mistake." But I'd stayed silent, curled up on my bed, crying into my pillow. The tears had been for everything. For the freedom I'd lost. For the trust that had been broken. For the feelings I'd started developing that now seemed foolish and naive. Around 3 in the morning, the knocking had finally stopped. I'd heard his footsteps retreat down the hallway. Slow and heavy, part of me had wanted to run after him, to hear the explanation, to try to understand, but I'd forced myself to stay in bed, because this wasn't about understanding. This was about principle. This was about me finally standing up for myself, finally demanding to be treated as a person with rights and choices. The sun had risen on a new day and I'd still been awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling empty. I'd mentally gone through my option. I could leave. Apparently I'd been able to leave for weeks. But where would I go? What would I do? The practical concerns warred with the emotional ones. And underneath everything was a question I didn't want to examine too closely. Did I actually want to leave? Not because I couldn't, but because some part of me wanted to stay. That question had scared me more than anything else. Because it suggested that maybe I'd developed something like Stockholm Syndrome. Maybe I'd bonded with my captor in some unhealthy way. Or maybe, and this was even more frightening, maybe my feelings were real. Maybe despite everything, despite how we'd met and the power imbalance and the lies, I genuinely developed feelings for Addison Kane. And if that was true, what did it say about me? Was I really so starved for affection, so desperate for connection, that I'd fall for the man who bought me? The thoughts had spiraled darker and darker until finally, exhausted, I'd fallen into a fitful sleep as dawn broke. My dreams had been fragmented, confused, images of Addison, of freedom, of locked doors and open roads, all mixed together until I couldn't tell what I wanted anymore. The next morning when I woke up, the house was completely silent. Addison was nowhere to be found. On the table was just an envelope with my name on it. I opened it and inside were some documents, my passport, birth certificate, and a debt clearance certificate that was properly signed and stamped. There was also money, cash, and a bank card, and there was a handwritten letter that was 3 pages long. Alton, forgive me. I know these words aren't enough, but I want to write them anyway. I should have told you earlier, everything that belongs to you is here. Documents, money that's rightfully yours from the contract settlement, and your complete freedom. You can go wherever you want. This house, this world, it's all your decision. If you stay, it's your choice. If you go, I won't stop you. I'll never stop you. The letter continued. I love you, Alton. This is my first love and maybe my last. But I can't imprison you. I can't become the person who takes your freedom away. You taught me what it means to be human. You made me realize I'm not just a monster. Maybe I was never worthy of you, but you became my world. If you leave, I'll understand. But if you decide to stay only for yourself, for your own happiness, then I'll be glad. But please make this decision only from your heart. Addison. I stood there reading the letter over and over. Tears came to my eyes, because this was the first time anyone had given me such importance. My happiness, my choices. Over the next few hours I asked myself many questions. If I left, where would I go? I had nobody. My mother had fled, my uncle had sold me, relatives had used me, college friends were only surface level. And Addison? He'd made a mistake. Yes. He'd hidden the truth from me. Yes. But he'd also protected me, cared for me, respected me in his own way, and now, he'd given me freedom, without any conditions. This wasn't about forgiving him quickly. My heart still hurt. But it was also true that for the first time in my life I was thinking, really thinking from my heart, about what I wanted. And the truth was, I didn't want to run. I wanted to stay here, but on my own terms, by my own choice. When Addison returned in the evening, he was shocked to see me. I was sitting in the living room waiting for him. He stood frozen at the doorway, as if he couldn't believe it. You stayed? He asked in a careful voice. I nodded. Yes. But things will be different now. He slowly approached me, hesitant, as if afraid I'd get angry again. How? He asked. First thing, I'm not your property. I'm your partner, equal. Second thing, you can't hide anything from me. Never. Third thing. I looked into his eyes. If you really love me, you'll have to prove it. Not with words, but with actions. It'll take time for me to trust you again. But I I'll try. He smiled slowly, the first real genuine smile I'd seen on his face. There were tears in his eyes. Deal, he said, and extended his hand forward. I took his hand, and in that moment, for the first time I felt like this was a beginning of a new life. One built on my choice, not someone else's control. Thank you, he whispered. For what? I asked. Because you gave me another chance. I promise, Alton, I'll never disappoint you. I released his hand and stood up. We'll see, I said, but my voice no longer held anger. It held hope. And maybe this is what real freedom means. The freedom that doesn't just come from papers but from the heart. The freedom built from trust and love. And I was ready now for this new life. By my own choice. The hours I'd spent alone that day had been transformative. I'd gone through every document carefully. The debt clearance was legitimate, stamped by officials, witnessed, legally binding. My mother's name had been completely removed from all records. It was as if the debt had never existed. The money Addison had left was substantial, enough to rent an apartment, enroll back in college, live comfortably for at least a year while I figured things out. The bank card had a note attached explaining it was in my name, that I could access it whenever I wanted. He'd thought of everything. He'd given me not just theoretical freedom but practical freedom. The means to actually leave and build a life. I'd walked through the mansion one more time, seeing it differently. This could be my home if I chose. Not a prison, but a home. The library where I'd spent so many hours could be my sanctuary. The garden I'd glimpsed through windows could be a place I actually explored. This life could be mine if I wanted it. But I'd had to be honest with myself about why I'd want it. Was it because I had nowhere else to go? Or was it because of Addison? I'd thought about the man I'd come to know over these weeks. Yes, he'd lied. Yes, he'd controlled information and made decisions without me. But he'd also been kind when he didn't have to be. He'd given me books and space and respect in small ways. He'd protected me with his own body. And now, he'd given me the ultimate gift: choice. Real choice. No pressure, no manipulation, just pure freedom to decide. The letter had been the deciding factor. Reading his words, seeing his handwriting slightly messy, rushed, emotional, had made him real in a way nothing else had. This wasn't some calculated manipulation. This was a man who'd realized he'd made a terrible mistake and was trying to fix it the only way he knew how. By letting go. By giving me power. By making himself vulnerable. When Addison had walked through the door that evening, he'd looked exhausted. His eyes were red-rimmed. His usually perfect appearance disheveled. He'd seen me and stopped completely. Like he'd been struck. The shock on his face had been genuine. He'd truly expected me to be gone. That realization had done something to my heart. He'd given me freedom expecting to lose me. That was sacrifice. That was love. Not the possessive, controlling thing from before, but real love that wanted what was best for the other person. Our conversation had been halting, careful. We were both walking on eggshells, aware that this moment would define everything going forward. When I'd laid out my conditions, I'd watched his face carefully. He hadn't argued, hadn't tried to negotiate. He'd just accepted, with what looked like profound relief. When we'd shaken hands, it had felt like a covenant, more serious and binding than any legal contract. This was a promise between two people who'd found each other in the strangest circumstances and were choosing, both of us now, equally, to see where this could go. As he'd stood there, tears in his eyes, I'd felt my own eyes getting wet. This was new. This was terrifying. This was hopeful. And for the first time since that night my uncle had sold me, I felt like I was in control of my own story. Whatever happened next would be because I chose it. And that made all the difference.